They told them it would be over by Christmas. That was the promise. When the young men of Europe marched away in August of 1914, flowers in the barrels of their rifles and cheering crowds lining the streets, they believed they were embarking on a great adventure. A quick, decisive lightning war that would settle old scores and bring glory to their nations. But by December, the adventure was dead. The glory was buried under 6 feet of freezing mud. And the war was not over. In fact, the nightmare had only just begun. To understand the miracle that was about to happen, you have to understand the hell these men were living in. By late 1914, the war of movement had ground to a halt. The armies had dug in, carving 2 jagged lines of trenches that stretched like an open wound across the face of Europe, from the North Sea all the way to the Swiss border. This was the stalemate. This was the Western Front. Life in those trenches was an assault on the human spirit. It rained constantly. The water didn't drain. It pooled, turning the earth into a thick, sucking clay that grabbed at boots and refused to quaver. Let go. Men stood in freezing water up to their knees for days at a time. Their feet swelled and went numb, turning black with gangrene in a condition they called trench foot. The smell was hideous. It was a mixture of unwashed bodies, chloride of lime, stale tobacco, and the sweet, sickly scent of the dead who lay unburied in the strip of land between the armies. That strip of land was called no man's land. In some places, it was half a mile wide, but in sectors like Ypres and Armentières, the enemies were incredibly close. Sometimes only 30 or 40 yards separated the British Tommies from the German Fritz. It was so close that you could smell their breakfast cooking, you could hear them coughing in the damp morning air, you could hear them laughing, or cursing, or singing. And that proximity did something strange to the psychology of the soldier. The propaganda back home painted the enemy as a faceless monster, a barbarian who needed to be destroyed. But when you are 30 yards away, listening to a man complain about the rain just like you are, it becomes very hard to maintain the illusion that he is a monster. You begin to realize he is just another poor soul stuck in the same mud, freezing in the same cold, waiting for the same orders. As Christmas approached, the weather shifted. The relentless rain stopped, and a hard frost set in. The mud froze solid. The air became crisp and clear. And on Christmas Eve, December 24th, the moon rose full and bright, illuminating the frosted barbed wire with a ghostly silver light. It started with the lights. British sentries peering over the parapets, eyes straining into the darkness, saw something flickering on the German line. They weren't muzzle flashes. They were steady, warm glows. The faux Germans were placing candles on the rims of their trenches. They were setting up Tannenbäume, small Christmas trees that had been sent to the front by the thousands on orders of the Kaiser to boost morale. It was a reckless thing to do. In normal times, a light on the parapet was an invitation for a sniper's bullet. But that night, no one fired. Then came the sound. It wasn't the shriek of artillery or the rattle of a machine gun. It was a deep, rich baritone voice drifting across the frozen cratered earth. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. The British soldiers knew the tune. It was Silent Night. They listened in stunned silence as the German voices joined together, growing louder, harmonizing in the cold air. For the first time in 5 months, the sound of the front was not death. It was beauty. When the Germans finished, the British soldiers, moved by a sudden impulse, began to applaud. Then, they started to sing back. They sang the first Noel. When they finished, the Germans clapped. It became a surreal competition, a carol service held in the middle of a slaughterhouse. They sang back and forth, trading hymns like artillery shells, until the Germans started singing "O Come, All Ye Faithful." The British joined in, singing the English words over the Latin and German, Adeste Fidelis. For a moment, the two armies were united by a melody that transcended language and borders. The singing broke the tension, but what happened next broke the war. Voices began to call out across no man's land. "We no shoot. Hello, Tommy. Hello, Fritz. You no shoot." It was a terrifying moment. Officers on the British side were frantic. They feared it was a trap, a trick to lure them out into the open, to be mowed down by machine guns. They ordered their men to stay down, to keep their heads low, to prepare for an attack. But curiosity and a desperate hunger for human connection were stronger than military discipline. One German soldier climbed out of his trench. He stood there, silhouetted against the moonlight, unarmed, his hands raised. Then another followed, and another. Seeing this, a British soldier, perhaps driven by bravery, or perhaps by sheer exhaustion, threw down his rifle and climbed up to meet them. Suddenly, the dams burst. All along the line, hundreds of men began to scramble up the sides of the trenches. They walked tentatively at first, crunching over the frozen ground, navigating through the tangle of barbed wire. They met in the middle of no man's land. Imagine the scene. These were men who had been trying to kill each other hours before. Men who had been trained to hate. And now, they were shaking hands. They were patting each other on the back. They were looking into the faces of the people they were supposed to destroy, seeing only reflections of themselves. They began to trade whatever they had in their pockets. The Germans had sausages and cigars, luxuries that the British soldiers envied. The British had their famous bully beef and tins of plum pudding. They swapped regimental buttons, cutting them off their tunics as souvenirs. They exchanged hats. They showed each other photographs of their families, tattered, dirty. Pictures of wives in Sunday dresses and children they hadn't seen in months. One British officer, Captain Bruce Bairnsfather, described the scene in his diary. He wrote, "I wouldn't have missed this unique and weird Christmas day for anything. I spotted a German officer, some sort of lieutenant I should think, and being a bit of a collector, I intimated to him that I had taken a fancy to some of his buttons. I brought out my wire clippers and, with a few deft snips, removed a couple of his buttons and put them in my pocket. I then gave him 2 of mine in exchange. There was laughter. There was sharing of schnapps and rum. There was a barber who set up a stool in the middle of a shell crater and gave haircuts to soldiers of both sides. It was a festival of humanity in the place where humanity was supposed to be dead. But amidst the joy, there was a solemn reality that had to be addressed. The truce provided a rare opportunity to bury the dead. For weeks, bodies had lain out in no man's land, unreachable due to the constant fire. Now, in the quiet of Christmas morning, British and German soldiers worked side by side to dig graves. It was a grim task, chipping away at the frozen earth. But doing it together brought a profound sense of shared grief. They held joint burial services. A British chaplain read the 23rd Psalm, and the Germans stood with heads bowed, murmuring the words in their own language. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." In that moment, staring into the open graves of their friends, the absurdity of the war was laid bare. They weren't enemies, they were partners in suffering. And then, there was the football. The story of the football match is the most famous legend of the Christmas Truce. And while historians debate the details of organized games, we know for the fact that kickabouts happened. It wasn't a professional match with referees and goalposts. It was chaotic joy. Someone produced a ball, or perhaps a tin can wrapped in rags, and suddenly, 50, maybe 100 men were chasing it across the ice. Boots sliding, men laughing, breath pluming in the air. A German lieutenant, Kurt Zamisch of the 134th Saxons, wrote in his diary, "The English brought a soccer ball from the trenches, and pretty soon a lively game ensued. How marvelously wonderful. Yet how strange it was. The English officers felt the same way about it. Thus Christmas, the celebration of love, managed to bring mortal enemies together as friends. For a time, for that brief window, the war didn't exist. There were no allies, no central powers, just young men playing a game they all loved, reverting to the boys they were before the world put uniforms on them and told them to kill. But time in war is a cruel thing. As the sun began to set on Christmas Day, the sky turning a bruised purple, the truce began to fray at the edges. The reality of their duty started to creep back in. The generals, miles behind the lines in their comfortable chateaus, were furious when news of the truce reached them. This fraternization was considered treason. It undermined the very spirit of the offensive. How can you convince a man to charge a machine gun nest if he has shared a cigarette with the gunner? Orders were issued immediately. Strict disciplinary action for any soldier found consorting with the enemy. The artillery was ordered to resume firing to break the silence. The farewells that evening were heavy. Men shook hands one last time, knowing that the next time they saw each other, It would be through the sights of a rifle. A British soldier recalled a German telling him, "Tomorrow, we fight, but I will shoot high." They retreated back into their holes in the ground. The candles were extinguished. The trees were taken down. The silence that fell over the trenches that night was different from the silence of Christmas Eve. It wasn't a silence of peace. It was a silence of waiting. A heavy, guilty silence. In some sectors, the truce dragged on for a few days, until New Year's. Neither side wanted to fire the first shot. But the war machine was relentless. Fresh troops were brought in, men who hadn't played football, men who hadn't seen the photos of the German children. The artillery, barrages intensified. The snipers returned to their posts. The war roared back to life, louder and bloodier than before. The Christmas Truce of 1914 was never repeated. In the years that followed, in 1915 and 1916, the High Command made sure to bombard the lines on Christmas Eve to drown out any singing. The war became more industrial, more cynical. Poison, gas, tanks, and flamethrowers turned the battlefield into something even more horrific. The innocence of 1914 was gone, crushed under the weight of attrition. Most of the men who shook hands in no man's land that day did not survive the war. They fell at the Somme. They drowned in the mud of Passchendaele. They were vaporized at Verdun. They are gone now, lost to history. So why do we tell this story? Why, more than a century later, does the image of those soldiers meeting in the snow still haunt us? It's because it represents a flicker of light in the darkest of times. Strategically, the Christmas Truce achieved nothing. It didn't end the war. It didn't save lives in the long run. It didn't move the borders a single inch. But morally, it was a victory of immense proportions. It proved that the hatred required for war is artificial. It has to be manufactured by governments and sustained by lies. It proved that deep down, the natural instinct of humanity is not to kill, but to connect, to share, to play. It showed that beneath the uniforms, beneath the nationalism and the propaganda, we are all terrified, freezing, lonely people who just want to be home for Christmas. Those men in 1914 were heroes, not because they fought, but because for one glorious, freezing day, they refused to fight. They dropped their weapons and reached out a hand. And in doing so, they left us a legacy. A reminder that even in the midst of total destruction, peace is always a choice. It is a fragile choice, easily broken, but it is there, waiting for someone brave enough to climb out of the trench and take the first step. The war would rage on for 4 more years. Millions would die. Empires would fall. The world would change forever. But for those few hours in the snow, surrounded by the ruin of civilization, humanity won. And that is a victory worth remembering.